officials play in that conversation. Your role as a county clerk in New Mexico gave you an important voice in making sure that you can bring your expertise to bear in thinking about how to shape voting reform policy there, especially given that the composition in your House changed for the first time in 60 years in a way that created a dangerous cocktail, if you will, between the Secretary of State and the House in could potentially push forward restrictive legislation, and that actually didn't happen. Tell us how you were able to beat the odds of that. How did you organize a coalition that was led, through your efforts as an election official to create some bipartisan support for online voter registration and other reforms?
Well, thanks, Nora, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this. I have been the county clerk in Bernalillo County, which is the Albuquerque metropolitan area, for the last 8.5 years. And almost since the beginning of my time as clerk, we've had a coalition, an election administration coalition, working on these issues in New Mexico. And primarily what we did for years and years is we successfully beat back voter ID legislation, photo voter ID legislation. We're still a state that does not require photo voter ID. We're very proud of it. And as a result of this most recent legislative session in 2015, we still don't require photo voter ID in New Mexico. And I think that that's one thing that we continue to hang our hats on over the years. But as Leora was talking about, at a certain point, you have to get off the defense and start working on the offense. And frankly, if you like sports analogies, and I'm sure everyone in this room does, the best defense is a good offense. So you need to focus on the things that you can talk about, and Leora sort of alluded to this as well, that are pushing forward the message about why it's important to expand the right to vote, why it's important to expand access to the ballot box. And so what we started about 4 years ago as a coalition was to push legislation that really would accomplish those goals. And some of the things that we talk about and push are things that we all know and love, like same-day registration and expanded early voting, more early voting in rural parts of the state, and things like this. But the other things, and the things that we've been really successful on in New Mexico, are the much less sexy, but also extremely powerfully effective things. And there are a lot of the things that we're talking about here today. Online voter registration, protections for overseas and military voters. We created vote centers on election day, which we've been administering very successfully in the urban centers in New Mexico that are creating and fostering opportunities for people to cast a ballot. And so in this most recent legislative session, we did have the challenge. We had the challenge of the House shifting last year. I know intimately that there was a very challenging and dirty race for Secretary of State in which my opponent campaigned on photo voter ID, and and we all kind of know what the outcome was there. And so going into this legislative session, we sort of really expected to be on the defense, and we expected to see a lot of things potentially coming our way that are more restrictive. And interestingly, and I think really due to the work of the coalition that I've been working with over the last several years, not only did we not see a whole lot of defensive bills, but as the lead lobbyist for the coalition, I was personally tracking 30 total bills, 3 of which were bad bills, 2 of which were different versions of photo voter ID, and one was a study on biometric voter identification, which is really ridiculous. And the,
like swabbing your mouth to vote?
Yeah, pinpricks, and I don't know. I scanned weird stuff.
But still lots of paper.
But 27 of those bills were progressive, good pieces of legislation that would help us expand. And what we ended up doing is working with the coalition, working with the leadership in the Senate, and then amazingly, we ended up working with the leadership in the House and the Secretary of State, because the Secretary of State at the end of the day decided that she did not want to get through another legislative session without having a single piece of legislation to show for her time in office. And we were able to compromise and agree on an omnibus election package that, again, addressed a lot of the not very sexy, sort of uncontroversial sounding and looking things, like online voter registration, for all of the reasons that Henry talked about, right? It's more secure, it costs a lot less money to implement, it creates all sorts of good opportunities for voters, and so really there was not anything that. Basically, there was something for everybody to love in this election package. We threw military overseas voters and protections for first responders in there. We created an opportunity for New Mexico to enter into interstate data sharing agreements, so we can not only clean up the voting rolls, but we can also use that as an opportunity to reach out to people who moved moved into our state and offer them opportunities to register to vote. And so really at the end of the day, I think because we have sort of laid the groundwork over all of these years of trying to advance these things, we've flown under the radar, and we've really looked at substantive policies that are not necessarily controversial, and we've really worked hard on those and tried to hang our hat on those. I think that's why we've been so successful. And again, I don't know if other states, and Leroy, you mentioned y'all had reached out to election officials. I've been a part of the coalition in New Mexico since day one. And other of my fellow clerks have, and we also have a legislator or two that's been involved with the coalition over the years. And I think having those elected officials at the table, and one thing, Denora, before I close, that I think is important to mention is that there is something about the messengers you choose when you're doing this work. And for reasons that may not seem obvious necessarily, having election officials before the legislature talking about why this is a good thing for how we can better run elections, I think tends to be a really key ingredient that can really help with these pieces of legislation and moving these bills forward, and even playing defense on some of the bad things. So if you all are looking at doing this work in your states, I would really look at trying to build relationships with your local elected officials, and if you would like any suggestions on how to do that, I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much.